On a frozen mountain 11,000 feet above the world, 16 young men made a choice so unthinkable it would haunt them for the rest of their lives, and it's the only reason any of them ever came home. This is the true story of Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571, and before we go any further, you should know something. Everything you're about to hear actually happened. No dramatization, no embellishment, just the facts of the most extreme survival story of the 20th century, and the price these men paid to live through it. It started with something completely ordinary. In October of 1972, a group of amateur rugby players from a club called Old Christians, based in Montevideo, Uruguay, chartered a plane to fly them across the Andes Mountains to Santiago, Chile, for a friendly match. 19 members of the team were on board, along with friends, family, and supporters who'd come along for the trip. 40 passengers, 5 crew, 45 people total, most of them in their late teens and 20s, joking, laughing, looking forward to a few days away from home. Nobody on that plane had any reason to think it would be the last ordinary day of their lives. The flight left Montevideo on October the 12th. Almost immediately, the weather turned against them. Storms over the Andes forced the pilots to put down early in Mendoza, Argentina, to wait things out. They spent the night there, and the next afternoon, under pressure to get back in the air, Uruguayan military aircraft weren't permitted to stay grounded in Argentina for more than 24 hours. They took off again. October the 13th, a Friday. If you believe in omens, this is the one to remember. To cross the Andes safely, the flight plan called for the pilots to track their position using radio beacons buried somewhere in that vast, mountainous nothing below. Because at that altitude, in that weather, there was no way to navigate by sight alone. Somewhere along that route, a critical error was made. The co-pilot, flying the aircraft while training under the more experienced captain, believed they had already cleared the mountain range. He began the descent toward Santiago far too early. In reality, they were nowhere close. They were still deep inside the Andes, boxed in on every side by jagged granite peaks rising thousands of feet into the clouds, and the plane was dropping directly into them. Passengers would later describe a sudden, violent jolt of turbulence. Then, through the windows, a wall of black rock appearing where there should have been open sky. The pilots fought to pull the nose up, to clear the ridge ahead. For one suspended second, it must have looked like they were going to make it. They didn't. The wing clipped the mountain and tore away instantly. The tail went with it, ripping a hole straight through the back of the fuselage and sucking 3 people out into the open sky, gone before anyone could even react. What remained of the aircraft, now just a stripped, wingless metal shell, became a toboggan, hurtling down the mountainside at terrifying speed, smashing through snow and ice for what survivors remember as an eternity, before finally grinding to a stop on a glacier in one of the most remote, inhospitable places on the entire planet. 12 people were dead within the first few hours. 33 were left alive, crammed inside the broken fuselage, many of them badly injured, broken bones, head wounds, internal damage. Nobody on that mountain had the tools, the medicine, or in most cases, the training to treat. Outside, the temperature was already plummeting well below freezing, and night was coming fast. They were sitting at roughly 11,500 feet in a valley walled in by peaks more than twice that height. No flat ground for a rescue plane to land on. No trees, no vegetation of any kind, anywhere, just rock, ice, and endless white in every direction, swallowing the wreckage so completely it became nearly invisible from above. And it was from above that hope was supposed to come. For the first several days, the survivors had to believe rescue was close. Search planes from Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay combed the mountains in grid patterns, hunting for any sign of the flight that had simply vanished off radar. But the terrain worked against them with what almost feels like deliberate cruelty. The white fuselage against endless white snow blended into the landscape so perfectly that search pilots flew directly over the crash site more than once and saw absolutely nothing. Inside, the survivors rationed what little food had been packed for a 4-hour flight. Not a siege. A few chocolate bars, some crackers, a little wine. It lasted almost no time at all. They melted snow for water. At night, they stacked themselves together inside the wreckage for warmth, taking turns at the freezing edges and the slightly less freezing middle. Two of the passengers had some medical training, and their basic understanding of trauma and anatomy became the only thing keeping several badly wounded survivors alive at all. On the 8th day, the search was officially called off. The survivors didn't learn this immediately. It took 3 more days, gathered around a small transistor radio pulled from the wreckage, for the news to finally reach them. Search and rescue operations had been suspended. The mountains were too vast. The wreckage was too well hidden. The odds of finding anyone alive were considered too low to keep risking search crews. As far as the rest of the world was concerned, everyone on Flight 571 was already dead. Sit with that for a second. 11 days into a nightmare, freezing, starving, surrounded by the dead and the dying, and then hearing, through static on a tiny radio, that no one is coming, that you've been written off. For some people, that would have been the moment to simply lie down and stop fighting. For these survivors, it became the opposite. It was the exact moment they understood, with total clarity, that if they were going to live, no one was going to save them but themselves. But survival needs fuel, and there was none left, not a crumb. They tried eating foam ripped from the seats. They chewed on scraps of leather torn from suitcases, hoping for some trace of nutrition. There wasn't any. Altitude sickness, starvation, and the relentless cold were breaking their bodies down at a terrifying speed. Without food, every single one of them was going to die on that mountain, and they all knew it, which forced them to confront a thought almost too horrifying to say out loud. Outside the fuselage, preserved by the freezing temperatures almost like a refrigerator, lay the bodies of their friends, their teammates, in some cases, their own family members, people they'd grown up with, people they'd been laughing with on this very plane less than 2 weeks earlier. The idea was raised, and at first, it was met with revulsion. Several of the survivors refused to even consider it, calling it a line that simply could not be crossed, no matter what. There were arguments, there was anguish. Some of them, raised in devout households, wrestled with whether doing this would be a sin too far, a betrayal beyond forgiveness, even in the name of staying alive. But hunger doesn't negotiate. Days passed, and the weakest among them kept growing weaker, and slowly, an unbearable logic took hold. The people they had loved were already gone. What remained outside in the snow was no longer them, just tissue, frozen and untouched by decay. That could be the difference between the rest of them living through this or not. Some described it later as something closer to an unwilling transplant, using what the dead no longer needed, so the living might get one more day. Others found a strange peace in their faith, deciding their friends, given the choice, would have wanted exactly this, for their deaths to mean something, instead of nothing at all. It did not make the act any less unbearable. Survivors described forcing themselves to swallow, fighting their own body's urge to reject it, weeping as they did the one thing their minds screamed against and their starving bodies demanded. One man on that mountain could never bring himself to do it, and chose to starve instead, a choice the others respected completely, even as they made the opposite one to stay alive. There was no triumph in any of this, no relief, only survival, bought at the highest possible price, one impossible decision at a time. And just when it seemed like the mountain had done its worst, it wasn't finished with them. Roughly 2.5 weeks after the crash, in the dead of night, while the survivors slept packed together for warmth, an avalanche tore down the slope above the fuselage. Tons of snow crashed into the wreckage in seconds, crushing the shelter, burying the survivors alive in total darkness. Snow pressing into their mouths, their throats, stealing the air straight out of their lungs. Several who had clawed their way through 11 days of starvation, grief, and the unthinkable decision about the dead did not survive this. They suffocated in their sleep, buried under the snow inside the very shelter that had kept them alive until then, including the team's own captain, the steady presence who had helped hold the entire group together through the worst of it so far. The ones who lived had to dig themselves out with bare, frostbitten hands, clawing upward, gasping for air, screaming the names of friends they couldn't reach in time. When it was over, the group that had once numbered 45 had been cut down to a fraction of that, trapped now inside a half-collapsed fuselage, with a storm outside that made digging out impossible for days. The survivors had to face a new, darker possibility, that this mountain simply intended to kill every last one of them, slowly, one disaster at a time, no matter what they did to fight back, and yet, somehow, impossible. Impossibly, they kept going. As the weeks dragged on, it became clear that no one was coming to find them. If they wanted to live, someone was going to have to walk out of those mountains themselves. It sounds almost absurd to even consider. There were no roads, no trails, nothing but endless rock and ice in every direction. And whoever attempted it would have no climbing gear, no proper boots, no map, nothing but instinct and desperation. A few early attempts failed completely, survivors turning back exhausted, beaten by terrain that trained mountaineers with proper equipment would have struggled to cross. Finally, in December, after weeks of preparation, stitching together a crude sleeping bag from seat insulation and fabric, saving whatever small scraps they could carry as provisions for the road, 2 of the survivors set out. One of them had lost his mother and his younger sister in the crash and its aftermath. The other was one of the medical students who had spent weeks keeping the wounded alive. Together, they began climbing toward a peak they believed, hoped, would finally lead them out of the Andes. What followed was 10 days of climbing above 17,000 feet into air so thin it could barely sustain them, through nights so cold that simply falling asleep risked never waking up again. When they finally reached the top of that first ridge, they discovered the cruelest twist of the entire ordeal. Not the valley and civilization they'd been praying for, but more mountains, more impossible terrain, stretching out ahead of them as far as they could see. They kept walking anyway, because turning back meant certain death, not just for them, but for everyone still waiting back at the wreckage. After days of descending through valley after valley, pushed to the absolute edge of human endurance, they finally saw something that shouldn't have been possible. After more than 60 days of total isolation, a man on horseback, on the far side of a river, an ordinary local herdsman, going about an entirely ordinary afternoon, with no idea that 2 living, breathing survivors of a plane crash the world had long since written off as a tragedy, with no survivors at all, were standing across the water, waving, shouting, unable to be heard over the rushing current, unable to cross. They wrote down everything, where they'd come from, how many were still alive on that mountain, that they had nothing left to survive on, weighted the note with a stone, and threw it across the river. It was the first piece of information the outside world had received about Flight 571 in over 2 months. The herdsman rode for hours to raise the alarm, and from there, everything that had moved at a glacial, agonizing pace for 10 weeks suddenly moved at the speed of helicopters and rescue teams and doctors. On December the 22nd and 23rd, more than 2 months after the crash, the remaining survivors, stranded at 11,000 feet, were finally airlifted out. The rescue made just as difficult by the same brutal terrain that had trapped them there in the first place. Of the 45 people who boarded that flight in Montevideo, believing they were headed to a rugby match, 16 walked off those helicopters alive. When the full story emerged, not just the crash, not just the cold and the avalanche, but the truth of exactly how 16 people had survived 72 days with almost no food at all, it stunned the entire world. Reporters descended on Montevideo, photographs of gaunt, hollow-eyed young men, barely recognizable from the smiling faces in photos taken before the flight, ran in newspapers across the globe. There was horror, there was judgment from people who'd never been forced to make a choice like theirs, but there was also, eventually, a kind of stunned, reluctant awe for what the human body and the human will are capable of enduring when there is, quite literally, no other option left. The survivors came to call it the miracle of the Andes. Many of them stayed close for the rest of their lives, bound by something most people will thankfully never have to understand. They built careers, started families, became doctors, businessmen, public figures. Entirely ordinary lives, carried forward by men who had once done the most extraordinary, unthinkable thing simply to keep breathing one more day. Decades later, several of them returned to that mountain, to the exact spot where the wreckage finally came to rest, not as a place of horror anymore, but as something closer to sacred ground, the place where, against every conceivable odds, they chose to live. And that, in the end, is the part of this story that stays with you longest. Not the crash, not even the unthinkable decision they were forced into to survive it, but the simple, staggering fact that 16 young men, abandoned by the search, buried by an avalanche, starving at the edge of the world, refused to stop fighting for just one more day, then another and another, for 72 days straight, until, finally, somebody came.